Ukraine and the international response to it. I'm joined from London by Alexander Nekrassov. He's a former investigative journalist and advisor to the Kremlin. Why don't we start there with what Kate Parkinson said? They hope it doesn't come there. What can prevent the war from converging on this area in eastern Ukraine?
Well, first of all, this surge of diplomatic activity, you must understand that it happened because the Europeans, primarily Germany and France, have realized that the situation is getting out of control. And this is why we see this sudden surge in this activity and you know, phone calls, and people are raising expectations and then downplaying the expectations for the Minsk summit. The problem is, of course, that nothing new is on the table. Now, there are leaks made about the content of the new proposal, which is going to be discussed in Minsk. But as far as I know from my sources, nothing new is in them compared to the initial Minsk agreement.
Well, let me start. Alexander, let me just interrupt for a second. What are you hearing from your sources about what the contents are?
Well, the contents is to create a demilitarized zone of 50 kilometers and take out all the heavy artillery from it. But that was in the previous agreement anyway. The only new addition is that Russia has signaled its willingness to look at the possibility of peacekeeping, international peacekeeping forces, which will be guarding, you know, the border between the two parties. But unfortunately, this question can be bogged down easily for weeks and months because the Western side will be suggesting United Nations or NATO. The Russians will not accept that. They will be suggesting the CIS countries, former Soviet Union, and Russia itself. And obviously NATO will not agree to that. I don't really see that, you know, whole process progressing much. I think that what is important is that all sides realize the conflict is getting out of control. It can spread. It can spread not just across eastern Ukraine. It can start spreading much further than that. That's the only reason why Merkel and Hollande suddenly dashed to Moscow and everybody said, oh, that was unexpected. It was expected, in a sense. And Putin, I think, is playing his cards very cunningly in a sense that he's saying, yes, of course, we need to sort this out. But guys, you really need to change your position. You can't threaten us with sanctions. You can't blackmail us. And I think that is the right approach. I don't really see very much happening in Minsk, but I see that it's probably this realization of everyone involved.
Alexander, let me just jump in for a second because we don't have a lot of time, and I want to ask you about this phone call. The Kremlin released the information that Russian President Putin and U.S. President Obama talked on the phone. They highlighted the necessity to find political solutions to this crisis in eastern Ukraine. Is that a step in the right direction, the fact that at least there's some dialogue going on between these two leaders?
Well, I think it was more of a symbolic thing, of course. Of course, it's good when leaders talk. I don't think they agreed on anything over that conversation. I think what Obama's administration is doing wrong is putting pressure about this supplying lethal aid to the Ukrainian army. First of all, you have to be a naive person to think that NATO and America included have not been already providing arms for third parties and directly to the Ukrainian army, which would not have been able to fight for that long because they didn't really simply have the resources. So that is already happening. We are now talking about heavy armory. Now that would be a big mistake. Even to talk about it is a big mistake. But to actually do that, that will inflame the situation to an extent that Russia might be pushed into actually sending troops into Ukraine, because that will change the situation completely.
Alexander, as you know, Putin's in Egypt, again saying that the European Union and the U.S. are responsible for the crisis in Ukraine because of expansionist policies. But if you were to poll people here in Washington, D.C., they say the reverse is true. What would you say to them? They see Putin as the expansionist.
Well, of course, because unfortunately the Western coverage takes out the key element of this crisis, the coup in February last year in Kiev, when a Ukrainian regime, a legitimate one, was overthrown. And of course, in Russia, the perception is that America and the EU was behind that coup. So since that coup, the whole crisis started to develop. This was a chain reaction. And that is the perception in Russia. And unfortunately, as long as both sides are going to continue to accuse each other, I don't think how this whole situation can be resolved. I think the only way out, if they would ask me, like a former Kremlin advisor, what do I say now? I would say, let Kyiv and the rebels talk. Let them talk without any other involvement. Let them sit down together. Let them try several times. Nobody expects, it to happen in one day, in one meeting, or 2 meetings, or 3 meetings. It has to be a long process. But there has to be a will from both sides. And the will is created by Russia and the West. Russia putting pressure on the rebels, the West putting pressure on the Kyiv regime.
Now, one final question. You brought up perception. We're just about out of time, but I want to ask you about perceptions. What do you make of the optics? German Chancellor Angela Merkel wraps up talks with Putin. She jets to Washington, D.C. to brief the U.S. president, the president of the United States, and Putin on the phone. They're trying to find a diplomatic solution, but then people to look at Putin, he's going to an opera in Egypt. It doesn't seem as though he seems as intent on coming up with a solution as these other leaders.
Well, because Putin was trying his best to do something, to achieve something. Russia has come up so many times with so many proposals that, it's really becoming ridiculous. So I think what is happening now is Putin saying, look, the ball is in your court. You have to come up with something as well. We can't be offering you one plan after another plan, and you always say, no, no, it doesn't work, we can't accept that. So now it's your turn. You come up with something. And I think that is why some of the Kremlin officials have been downplaying this process, because they don't want to be seen as responsible for a possible failure at Minsk.
All right. Alexander Nekrassov joining us from London. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us.